invited as our guest speaker this morning for three reasons. A gentleman, he loves Jesus, he has a compelling life story, and he is a distinguished man of science and healing. We hope that he can help us sort some things out. May I introduce the Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at one of the world's great hospitals, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Dr. Benjamin Carson, Sr.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Obama, distinguished guests, which includes everybody. Thank you so much for this wonderful honor to be at the stage again. I was here 16 years ago, and the fact that they've invited me back means that I didn't offend too many people. So that was great. I want to start by reading four texts, which will put into context what I'm going to say. Proverbs 11:9. With his mouth, the godless destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous escape. Proverbs 11:12. A man who lacks judgment derides his neighbor, but a man of understanding holds his tongue. Proverbs 11:25. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. And 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. You know, I have an opportunity to speak in a lot of venues. This is my fourth speech this week. And I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people. And I've been asking people, what concerns you? What are you most concerned about in terms of the spirituality and the direction of our nation and our world? And I've talked to very prominent Democrats, very prominent Republicans. And I was surprised by the uniformity of their answers. And those have informed my comments this morning. Now, it's not my intention to offend anyone. I have discovered, however, in recent years that it's very difficult to speak to a large group of people these days and not offend someone. And people walk around with their feelings on their shoulders waiting for you to say something. Did you hear that? And they can't hear anything else you say. The PC police are out in force at all times. I remember once I was talking to a group about the difference between a human brain and a dog's brain. And a man got offended. He said, you can't talk about dogs like that. But, you know, people just focus in on that, completely miss the point of what you're saying. And we've reached a point where people are afraid to actually talk about what they want to say because somebody might be offended. People are afraid to say Merry Christmas at Christmas time. It doesn't matter whether the person you're talking to is Jewish or, you know, whether they're any religion. That's a salutation, a greeting of goodwill. We've got to get over this sensitivity, you know, and it keeps people from saying what they really believe. You know, I'm reminded of a very successful young businessman, and he loved to buy his mother these exotic gifts for Mother's Day, and he ran out of ideas, and then he ran across these birds. These birds were cool. You know, they cost $5,000 a piece. They could dance, they could sing, they could talk. He was so excited he bought two of them. Sent them to his mother, couldn't wait to call her up on Mother's Day. Mother, what'd you think of those birds? And she said, they was good. He said, no, Mother, you didn't eat those birds. Those birds cost $5,000 a piece. They could dance, they could sing, they could talk. And she said, well, they should have said something. And you know, that's where we end up too if we don't speak up for what we believe. And you know what we need to do. What we need to do in this PC world is forget about unanimity of speech and unanimity of thought. And we need to concentrate on being respectful those people with whom we disagree. And that's when I think we begin to make real progress. And one last thing about political correctness, which I think is a horrible thing, by the way. I'm very, very compassionate, and I'm not ever out to offend anyone. But PC is dangerous. Because you see, this country, one of the founding principles was freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And it muffles people. It puts a muzzle on them. And at the same time, keeps people from discussing important issues while the fabric of their society is being changed. And we cannot fall for that trick. And what we need to do is start talking about things that are important, things that were important in the development of our nation. Well, one of those things was education. I'm very passionate about education because it's made such a big difference in my life. But here we are at a time in the world, the information age, the age of technology. And yet, 30% of people who enter high school in this country do not graduate. 44% of people who start a 4-year college program do not finish it in 4 years. What is that about? Think back to a darker time in our history, 200 years ago when slavery was going on. It was illegal to educate a slave, particularly to teach him to read. Why do you think that was? Because when you educate a man, you liberate a man. And there I was as a youngster, placing myself in the same situation that a horrible institution did because I wasn't taking advantage of the education. I was a horrible student. Most of my classmates thought I was the stupidest person in the world. They called me dummy. I was the butt of all the jokes. Now, admittedly, it was a bad environment. Single parent home. You know, my mother and father had gotten divorced early on. My mother got married when she was 13. She was one of 24 children. Had a horrible life. Discovered that her husband was a bigamist. Had another family. And she only had a 3rd grade education. She had to take care of us. Dire poverty. Had a horrible temper, poor self-esteem. All the things that you think would preclude success. But I had something very important. I had a mother who believed in me. And I had a mother who would never allow herself to be a victim, no matter what happened. Never made excuses, and she never accepted an excuse from us. And if we ever came up with an excuse, she always said, "Do you have a brain?" And if the answer was yes, then she said, "Then you could have thought your way out of it. It doesn't matter what John or Susan or Mary or anybody else did or said." And it was the most important thing she did for my brother and myself. Because if you don't accept excuses, pretty soon people stop giving them and they start looking for solutions. And that is a critical issue when it comes to success. Well, you know, we did live in dire poverty. And one of the things that I hated was poverty. You know, some people hate spiders, some people hate snakes. I hated poverty. I couldn't stand it. And, but, you know, my mother couldn't stand the fact that we were doing poorly in school. And she prayed and she asked God to give her wisdom. What could she do to get her young sons to understand the importance of developing their minds so that they control their own lives? And you know what? God gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was that wise. Because it was to turn off the TV. Let us watch only 2 or 3 TV programs during the week, and with all that spare time, read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. You know? And you know, she put check marks and highlights and stuff. But, you know, I just hated this. And my friends were out having a good time. Her friends would criticize her. They would say, "You can't make boys stay in the house reading books. They'll grow up, they'll hate you." And I would overhear them, and I'd say, "Mother, you know they're right." But she didn't care, you know. But after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books. Because we were very poor, but between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to read about people of great accomplishment. And as I read those stories, I began to see a connecting thread. I began to see that the person who has the most to do it You and what happens to you in life is you. You make decisions. You decide how much energy you want to put behind that decision. And I came to understand that I had control of my own destiny. And at that point, I didn't hate poverty anymore because I knew it was only temporary. I knew I could change that. It was incredibly liberating for me. It made all the difference. And continue on that theme of education. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study this country. The Europeans were fascinated. How could a fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, already be competing with them on virtually every level? This was impossible. De Tocqueville was going to sort it out. And he looked at our government, and he was duly impressed by the 3 branches of government. 4 now, because now special interest groups, but it was only 3 back in those days. And, he said, wow, this is really something. And then he said, but let me look at their educational system. And he was blown away. See, that anybody finishing the 2nd grade was completely literate. He could find a mountain man on the outskirts of society. The man could read the newspaper, could have a political discussion, could tell him how the government worked. If you really want to be impressed, take a look at the chapter on education in my latest book, America the Beautiful, which I wrote with my wife. Came out last year. And in that education chapter, you will see questions extracted from a 6th grade exit exam from the 1800s. A test you had to pass to get your 6th grade certificate. I doubt most college graduates today could pass that test. We have dumbed things down to that level. And the reason that is so dangerous is because the people who founded this nation said that our system of government was designed for a well-informed and educated populace. And when they become less informed, they become vulnerable. Think about that. Our system of government, and that's why the education is so vitally important. Now, some people say, you're overblowing it, things aren't that bad. And you're a doctor, a neurosurgeon. Why are you concerned about these things? I've got news for you. 5 doctors signed the Declaration of Independence. Doctors were involved in the framing of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, a whole bunch of things. It's only been in recent decades that we've extracted ourselves, which I think is a big mistake. We need doctors and we need scientists, engineers. We need all of those people involved in government, not just lawyers. I don't have anything against lawyers, but, here's the thing about lawyers. And I'm sorry, but I got to be truthful, okay? Got to be truthful. What do lawyers learn in law school? To win. By hook or by crook, you got to win. So you got all these Democrat lawyers and you got all these Republican lawyers, and their side wants to win. We need to get rid of that. What we need to start thinking about is how do we solve problems? And now, before I get shot, let me finish here. Now, one of the reasons, and I don't like to bring up problems without coming up with solutions. My wife and I started the Carson Scholars Fund 16 years ago after we heard about a survey, an international survey, looking at the ability of 8th graders in 22 countries to solve math and science problems. And we came out number 21 out of 22, barely beat out number 22, very concerning. And we'd go into schools and we'd see all these trophies, all-state basketball, all-state wrestling, all-state this, that, and the other. The quarterback was the big man on campus. And what about the intellectual superstar? What did they get? A National Honor Society pin? A pat on the head, there, little nerd? Nobody cared about them. And is it any wonder that sometimes the smart kids try to hide? They don't want anybody to know that they're smart. This is not helping us as a nation. So we started giving out scholarships to students from all backgrounds for superior academic performance and demonstration of humanitarian qualities. Unless you cared about other people, it didn't matter how smart you were. We got plenty of people like that. We don't need those. We need smart people who care about other people. We would give them money. The money would go into a trust. They would get interest on it. When they went to college, they get the money. But also the school gets a trophy. Every bit as impressive as any sports trophies. Goes right out there with the others. They get a medal. They get to go to a banquet. And we try to put them on the same kind of pedestal as we do the all-state athletes. Now, I have nothing against athletics or entertainment. Please believe me. You know, I'm from Baltimore. The Ravens won. This is great, okay? But what will maintain our position in the world? The ability to shoot a 25-foot jump shot or the ability to solve a quadratic equation? And we need to put the things into proper perspective. And, you know, many teachers, you know, many teachers have told us when we put a Carson Scholar in their classroom, the GPA of the whole class goes up over the next year. And it's been very gratifying. We started 16 years ago with 25 scholarships in Maryland. Now we've given out more than 5,000, and we're in all 50 states. But we also put in reading rooms. These are fascinating places that no little kid could possibly pass up. And they get points for the amount of time they spend in their reading, the number of books that they read, and they can trade them in for prizes. In the beginning, they do it for the prizes, but it doesn't take long before their academic performance begins to improve. And we particularly target Title I schools where kids come from homes with no books and they go to schools with no libraries. Those are the ones who drop out. And we need to truncate that process early on because we can't afford to waste any of those young people. You know, for every one of those people that we keep from going down that path of self-destruction and mediocrity, that's one less person you have to protect yourself and your family from. One less person you have to pay for in the penal or the welfare system. One more tax-paying, productive member of society who may invent a new energy source or come up with a cure for cancer. They're all important to us, and we need every single one of them. It makes a difference. And when you go home tonight, please read about it. Carson Scholars Fund. CarsonScholars.org. But why is it so important that we educate our people? Because we don't want to go down the same pathway as many other pinnacle nations who have preceded us. I think particularly about ancient Rome. Very powerful. Nobody could even challenge them militarily. But what happened to them? They destroyed themselves from within. Moral decay. Fiscal irresponsibility. They destroyed themselves. And if you don't think that can happen to America, you get out your books and you start reading. But you know, we can fix it. Why can we fix it? Because we're smart. We have some of the most intellectually gifted people leading our nation. All we need to do is remember what our real responsibilities are so we can solve the problems. I think about these problems all the time. And, you know, my role model was Jesus. And he used parables to help people understand things. And one of our big problems right now, and like I said, I'm not politically correct, so I'm sorry. But, you know, our deficit is a big problem. Think about it. And our national debt, $16.5 trillion. You think that's not a lot of money? Tell you what, count one number per second, which you can't even do because once you get to 1,000, it takes you longer than a second. But one number per second. You know how long it would take you to count the 16 trillion? 507,000 years. More than 500,000 years to get there. We have to deal with this. Here's the parable. A family falls on hard times. Dad loses his job or is demoted, gets part-time work. He has 5 children. He comes to the 5 children. He says, we're going to have to reduce your allowance. Well, they're not happy about it, but he said, except for John and Susan. They're special. They get to keep their allowance. In fact, we may give them more. How do you think that's going to go down? Not too well. Same thing happens. Enough said. What about our taxation system? So complex. There is no one who can possibly comply with every jot and tittle of our tax. If I wanted to get you or you, I could get you on a tax issue. That doesn't make any sense. What we need to do is come up with something that's simple. And when I pick up my Bible, you know what I see? I see the fairest individual in the universe, God, and he's given us a system. It's called tithe. Now, we don't necessarily have to do it 10%, but it's principle. He didn't say, if your crops fail, don't give me any tithes. He didn't say if you have a bumper crop, give me triple tithes. So there must be something inherently fair about proportionality. You make $10 billion, you put in $1 billion. You make $10, you put in $1. Of course, you got to get rid of the loopholes. But now some people say, well, that's not fair because it doesn't hurt the guy who made $10 billion as much as the guy who made 10. Where does it say you have to hurt the guy? He just put $1 billion in the pot. We don't need to hurt him. It's that kind of thinking. It's that kind of thinking that has resulted in 602 banks in the Cayman Islands. That money needs to be back here, building our infrastructure and creating jobs. And we're smart enough to figure out how to do that. We've already started down the path of solving one of the other big problems, healthcare. We need to have good healthcare for everybody. It's the most important thing that a person can have. Money means nothing, titles means nothing when you don't have your health. But we got to figure out efficient ways to do it. We spend a lot of money on healthcare, twice as much per capita as anybody else in the world, and yet not very efficient. What can we do? Here's my solution. When the person is born, give them a birth certificate, an electronic medical record, and a health savings account, to which money can be contributed pre-tax from the time you're born to the time you die. When you die, you can pass it on to your family members so that when you're 85 years old and you got 6 diseases, you're not trying to spend up everything. You're happy to pass it on, and there's nobody talking about death panels. That's number one. And also, for the people who are indigent, who don't have any money, we can make contributions to their HSA each month because we already have this huge pot of money. Instead of sending it to some bureaucracy, let's put it in their HSAs. Now they have some control over their own health care. And what do you think they're going to do? They're going to learn very quickly how to be responsible. When Mr. Jones gets that diabetic foot ulcer, he's not going to the emergency room and blowing a big chunk of it. He's going to go to the clinic. He learns that very quickly. Gets the same treatment. In the emergency room, they send him out. In the clinic, they say, now let's get your diabetes under control so you're not back here in 3 weeks with another problem. That's how we begin to solve these kinds of problems. It's much more complex than that, and I don't have time to go into it all. But we can do all of these things because we're smart people. And let me just begin to close here by another parable. Sea captain, and he's out on the sea near the area where the Titanic went down. And they look ahead, and there's a bright light right there. Another ship, he figures. And he tells his signaler, signal that ship, deviate 10 degrees to the south. Back comes the message. No, you deviate 10 degrees to the north. Well, he's a little bit incensed, He says, send a message. This is Captain Johnson. Deviate 10 degrees to the north. Back comes the message. This is Ensign 4th Class Riley. Deviate 10 degrees to the south. Now he's really upset. He says, send him a message. This is a naval destroyer. Back comes the message. This is a lighthouse. Enough said. Now, what about the symbol of our nation? The eagle. The bald eagle. It's an interesting story how we chose that. But a lot of people think we call it the bald eagle because it looks like it has a bald head. That's not the reason. It comes from the Old English word piebald, which means crowned with white. And we just shorten it to bald. Now use that the next time you see somebody who thinks they know everything. You get them on that one. But why is that eagle able to fly high? Forward, because it has 2 wings, a left wing and a right wing. Enough said. And I want to close with this story. 200 years ago, this nation was involved in a war, the War of 1812. The British, who are now our good friends, thought that we were young whippersnappers. It was time for us to become a colony again. They were winning that war, marching up the eastern seaboard, destroying city after city, destroyed Washington, D.C., burned down the White House. Next stop, Baltimore. As they came into the Chesapeake Bay, that armada of ships, warships, as far as the eye could see, it was looking grim. Fort McHenry standing right there. General Armistead, who was in charge of Fort McHenry, had a large American flag commissioned to fly in front of the fort. The admiral in charge of the British fleet was offended. He said, "Take that flag down. You have until dusk to take that flag down. If you don't take it down, we will reduce you to ashes." There was a young amateur poet on board by the name of Francis Scott Key, sent by President Madison to try to obtain the release of an American physician who was being held captive. He overheard the British plans. They were not going to let him off the ship. He mourned as dusk approached. He mourned for his fledgling young nation. And as the sun fell, the bombardment started. Bombs bursting in air, missiles, so much debris. He strained trying to see, was the flag still there? Couldn't see a thing. All night long it continued. At the crack of dawn, he ran out to the banister. He looked, straining his eyes, but all he could see was dust and debris. And then there was a clearing, and he beheld the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. The torn and tattered stars and stripes still waving. And many historians say that was the turning point in the War of 1812. We went on to win that war and to retain our freedom. And if you'd gone into the grounds of Fort McHenry that day, you would have seen at the base of that flag the bodies of soldiers who took turns propping up that flag. They would not let that flag go down because they believed in what that flag symbolized. And what did it symbolize? One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. God bless.
And my next guest, who happens to be a world-famous brain surgeon, has become even more of a sensation after lecturing President Obama on some of his biggest obstacles, those being the debt, taxes, and health care. Now, just yesterday at the National Prayer Breakfast, standing only a few feet from the president, Dr. Benjamin Carson took to the podium and shared some, well, pretty amazing, smart advice. Listen to this.
Our deficit is a big problem. Think about it. And our national debt, $16.5 trillion. You think that's not a lot of money? Tell you what, count one number per second. One number per second. You know how long it would take you to count the 16 trillion? 507,000 years. You make $10 billion, you put in $1 billion. You make $10, you put in 1. Of course, you got to get rid of the loopholes. Some people say, well, that's not fair because it doesn't hurt the guy who made $10 billion as much as the guy who made 10. Where does it say you have to hurt the guy? He just put $1 billion in the pot. You know, we don't need to hurt him.
Amazing speech. Move over, President Obama. The doctor is in the house. Joining me now, the man himself, author of America the Beautiful, Johns Hopkins University Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery, Dr. Benjamin Carson. Dr. Carson, I got to tell you, that speech moved me deeply. Very well done. What's the reaction been so far?
The reaction has been overwhelming. We've been just deluged with emails, with calls, 99.5% positive.
Wow.
And that doesn't surprise me because the way that I laid things out was really logical. It wasn't right wing, it wasn't left wing. It was just logic and common sense. And this is what people are starving for coming out of Washington, D.C. I don't know where we left our brains.
I don't know where we did either. Before I get into the content, and it was very deep and very profound to me, simple yet profound. Your background is amazing, and you talked about it in your speech. Your mom married at 13, one of 24 children. You grew up in poverty, and you had you said you were not a good student. But tell us a little bit, tell us that story, because I think everybody needs to hear it.
Yeah, well, you know, obviously I had all the strikes against me. Single parent home, dire poverty, poor self-esteem, horrible temper. These things tend to preclude success, and they would have in my case also. But my mother, who had only a third-grade education, refused to be a victim. That was the key. She never felt sorry for herself, and that was a good thing. But the problem was she never felt sorry for us either. So, you know, there was never an excuse that we could give that was good enough. And if we gave an excuse, she would come out with a poem called Yourself to Blame. And after a while, we just stopped looking for excuses. But she worked as a domestic, 2 and 3 jobs at a time, because she didn't want to be on welfare. Even though she only had a third-grade education, she was very observant, and she noticed that no one she ever saw go on welfare came off of it. So she didn't want to be dependent, and she didn't want us to be dependent either. So she would work as long and as hard as was necessary. Wow. And one of the things she observed in the homes where she worked is that people didn't watch a lot of TV. And they spent a lot of time reading and strategizing. So one day she came home and just turned the TV off. Said, you guys watch too much TV. If you improve yourself, if you improve your brain, one day people will be watching you on television. And of course she was right about that. And, you know, I hated reading because that's what she imposed upon us. You've got to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to me written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And I hated it because everybody else was outside playing and having a good time. But as I started reading, things began to happen. I was looking at words all the time. Suddenly, I could spell. I wasn't the first one to sit down in the spelling bee. Grammar and syntax. I learned how to express myself. You learn how to use your imagination rather than just observing somebody else's imagination. All of those make you into a terrific student. Within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class and began to have a much different view. What a great, and you said
you had to do those 2 book reports, and then you said your mother didn't know how to read them, but she convinced you she did.
Yeah, she put little check marks and highlights and things on them, and we would think that she was reading them.
Wow.
She did, I will tell you, to her credit, she did eventually get her GED. She went on to college, and in 1994, she got an honorary doctorate, so she's Dr. Carson now, too.
You talked a lot about political correctness. You said it's dangerous. You said it muzzles people. You said there's a PC police force out there. You said it prevents people from saying what they mean. That we need to get over our sensitivity. Explain.
Yeah. Well, you know, here's a nation, one of the founding pillars was freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And yet, we have imposed upon people restrictions on what they can say, on what they can think. And the media, I think, is the largest proponent of this, crucifying people who say things really quite innocently. I mean, you think back a few weeks ago, the sportscaster who commented on the beauty of the quarterback's female, and people thought, that can't be right. And there was a big brouhaha, and then finally they realized, well, I guess there's nothing wrong with it. And the woman even was thankful for the compliment. But this is the level of silliness that we've risen to.
All right, doctor, stay right there. We're going to come back. You're amazing. Dr. Carson, a lot has been made of the fact that some of the things you discussed in this speech are policies that are very contrary to the president. You talked at length about America's educational system failing. We're being dumbed down, is a phrase you used. The dangers of our debt and our deficit, class warfare, which you spoke out against, the tax issue, health savings accounts, that Rome can happen to America. What is your response to those that said, wow, you said that in front of the president?
Well, first of all, I should say that these are my own views. They don't represent the university that I'm employed by. But, you know, it really didn't matter who I was sitting in front of, because you know, I always pray before I give a speech, and I ask God to give me the right things to say. And I think that, that it's very rare these days for people to speak the truth. Everybody wants to go along to get along. And in the meantime, the fabric of our nation is being destroyed. We're going from a can-do nation to a what can you do for me nation. And I don't think that's what most people want, but you know, it's presented to them as the thing to do. And one of the real dangers which I alluded to in the speech, is the fact that people don't know anything. They don't know about history. They don't know about technology. They know so little that the news media is able to tell them whatever they want them to think. And they say it enough times and people say, oh, yeah, well, that's what they said on the news. And they don't think for themselves. The founders of our nation said, our nation will fundamentally change when people become so ignorant that they can be easily led.
Would you ever run for president, sir?
If the Lord grabbed me by the collar and made me do it, I would. It's not my intention.
I wouldn't wish that on you, but I think I would vote for you in a heartbeat.
Well, thank you. I have so many emails from people saying that I could probably finance my campaign if each one gave me a nickel.
Okay. What about, you gave a warning, though, about America. I share your concern. Morally, I see a decay in the country. $16.5 trillion in debt scares me. We're stealing from our kids. You came up with a great idea. I've always believed in health savings accounts. I don't like class warfare. What can we do to change things? You said we could either go down the direction of Rome, or we can change things.
Yeah, well, I think the brave leaders, not the ones who are just wrapped up in their egos. And, you know, I'm not pointing this at any particular person or at any particular party. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of people with a lot of hubris which just thinks my way or the highway. And the reason that I gave the example of the eagle with two wings, a left wing and a right wing, is that all good ideals don't reside in one party. But as the Bible says, in a multitude of counselors is safety. But in order to be able to use those counselors, we got to get rid of political correctness and let people say what they mean and really put their ideals out on the table and explain why those are good ideals. I would be willing to debate anyone on the president's team on health care and how it should be administered and how it can be done for less money.
I'll tell you what
I don't get a chance to do that.
Because we're running out of time, and I want you to come back and tell the story. You explained it so well on Francis Scott Key. I'm going to invite Austin Goolsbee on with you, and if you would come next week, maybe we can talk about those issues. Your book is amazing. The speech was amazing. I put it on my website, Hannity.com.
His speech at the National Prayer Breakfast is generating lots of buzz. He's the doctor who ended up upstaging the president by taking on the PC police. Let's listen to some of it.
The PC police are out in force at all times. We've reached a point where people are afraid to actually talk about what they want to say. Our deficit is a big problem. What about our taxation system? When I pick up my Bible, you know what I see? I see the fairest individual in the universe, God, and he's given us a system. It's called tithe.
Joining us now is pediatric neurosurgeon, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, and author of America the Beautiful, Dr. Benjamin Carson. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. We just showed a split screen there of you speaking and the president watching. He looked nonplussed, maybe a little annoyed. What was your interaction with him like after you spoke?
Well, he came over to me afterwards and said, thank you very much for your words. I really appreciate and admire you.
Huh? And doctor, was it awkward? I mean, basically, you were up there talking about, well, criticizing, I think, some of the ways the country is headed and some of the policies of the president. Was it awkward to be standing so close to him?
Actually, it wasn't, because I'm a different person when I get on stage. I sort of go into a zone. And, you know, I just asked the Lord to give me wisdom to say what's right at that particular time, and he always does. But, you know, it wasn't so much a criticism of him or anybody in particular as it was so much the system, where we're unable to work together, where we dig ourselves into our corners and we snipe at each other rather than solving the problems. And we're at a point in time where if we don't solve the problems, we're going to all be destroyed.
Now, you made what I thought was a really deep and really interesting point, basically on behalf of the flat tax. You said a just system would tax people at the same rate across the board. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, of course, you know, I alluded to God, and, you know, he said, I want a tithe. And he didn't say, if you don't have any money, don't give me any tithes. And he didn't say, if you're the richest man in the world, give me triple tithe. So proportionality, that's what's really fair, a percentage. And by definition, if you're a billionaire, you're going to pay a whole lot more than somebody who is poor. And that's fine. But I think everybody should put into the pot. Everybody should be a part of the equation. Everybody should have skin in the game. If God thought that was a good idea, I don't see why we think we're smarter than he is.
Dr. Carson, I was also interested to read what you think would be a logical solution to our health care woes in this country. What do you think would help?
Well, you know, one of the key things here is you've got to bring personal responsibility into the equation. You know, physicians and patients should be working together. You know, what do you need for good health care? You need a patient and you need a physician. Along came the middleman to facilitate the relationship, and now the middleman has become the primary entity with everybody else at its beck and call. That's why the whole thing is so distorted. We need to get the middleman out of it, and by having health savings accounts to which people can contribute from the day you're born to the day you die and pass it on when you die, you accumulate the resources that you need to be able to take care of your routine health care needs.
So you say cut out insurance, the middleman, and contribute to your own savings. You can pass it on to your kids, and that way you have personal responsibility.
Exactly. And, you know, you would have to create a system whereby people can have access to catastrophic health care. And one of the things that I tried to emphasize is we have to be able to sit down and say, what are the issues? What are the concerns of both sides? And if we can talk about what the issues are, lay them out, I think we can come to solutions. That's what intelligent people do. You know, come let us gather together and reason together. That's what the Bible says. In the multitude of counselors there is safety. But when we go off to
Well, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties, and what a shame, because that was one of the most interesting interviews I've seen in a while. That was, of course, Dr. Benjamin Carson from Baltimore. He's a world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, and he gave what has become truly a viral speech at the National Prayer Breakfast the other morning.
Absolutely. It was so fascinating. I'm hoping that that was just a storm-related satellite hiccup, and we're going to be able to get him back, because also his own personal backstory is also fascinating. Poverty-stricken.
Pretty remarkable.
He's
going to be, it looks like he's going to be almost drafted by force for higher office by his growing legion of fans online.
All right, we're going to try to get him back.
We are back with pediatric neurosurgeon, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, and author of America the Beautiful, Dr. Benjamin Carson. We're glad to have you. Dr. Carson, the response to your remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast has been pretty overwhelming online, and it would seem that going forward you might have a more prominent and regular voice in national affairs. Do you anticipate that?
Well, you know, I will let the Lord guide. You know, I am planning to retire at least from surgery on June the 30th. And, you know, I'll continue to teach and be involved in research and things of that nature. So it will free me up a little bit, although I have 10 international trips on the docket already and multiple other things.
Are you interested in getting into politics?
I don't have an inherent interest in doing it, but, you know, I will go where God wants me to go.
So where do you, tell us, give us some context for this. Your views are powerful, well articulated. A lot of people agree with them. Where do they come from?
Well, you know, I'm not a Democrat and I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent. If there was a party called the Logic Party, I would be a member of that, because there's so many things that are ideologically driven in Washington, D.C. That, coupled with the fact that we've now started a fourth branch of government known as special interest. Basically, anything that doesn't make any sense is because there's a special interest group involved. And we need to get back to a point where we're for, by, and of the people, and we need to do things that are beneficial for the people. And we've just totally gotten away from that. And I think it's going to require some brave people to stand up to a system that's entrenched in corruption. And every great nation, before its fall, has tolerated corruption. We have to deal with this.
Dr. Carson, I'm fascinated by your backstory. You were a poverty-stricken kid growing up with a mom who was overworked in inner-city Detroit, and you went on to be a renowned surgeon. How did that happen?
Well, the key thing for me was, my mother never gave up on me, and she never became a victim herself. And she always felt that there was something that you could do, and she never accepted excuses. And I think that's really the most important thing, because if people won't accept your excuses, you stop looking for excuses and you start looking for solutions. And both my brother and I became people who looked for ways to do things, not excuses. He is an aeronautical and mechanical engineer, and I'm a neurosurgeon. So I became the brain surgeon and he became the rocket scientist. But, the fact of the matter is, coming out of a horrible environment was not what was important. What was important was the mindset. When you begin to believe that you can do something and you're willing to put the energy into it, we live in the best nation in the world to be able to accomplish that. And we need to abolish the victim mentality and get people revved up again. This is the can-do nation. That's how we reach the pinnacle so fast.
That's a wonderful story. Do you think, you mentioned the victim mentality, do you think it's more prevalent today than it was when you were growing up?
I believe it's considerably more prevalent now. People are steeped in it from the time, that they're born. And they develop this entitlement, which is actually antithetical to societal success. It's never been productive of a great society, and it never will be. The other thing that is always horrible is great division. A wise man once said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. We need leadership that unites people, not leadership that divides people. And that's not, again, pointed at any particular individual. It's pointed at a system, and we need to get away from it.
Dr. Carson, how do you recommend getting away from the victimization that is so prevalent? I mean, from just kids, poor kids everywhere, be it Appalachia, be it a project in Detroit or Chicago. If they have no role models, where do they start?
Well, we have plenty of role models. You take something like the Horatio Alger Society, where you have 10 or 12 people inducted each year who came from nowhere and rose to the top. We don't talk about that very often. Most people don't even know about the Horatio Alger Society. We have numerous people throughout our society who would serve, I think, as excellent role models. We need to emphasize those. And Horatio Alger was very important to our country many, many years ago because he wrote stories, rags to riches stories. People read those, and they inculcated that into their own sense of who they were. And they began to think, I can do this. And they began to have a vision. If you don't have a vision, then you're certainly not going to accomplish anything. And the Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. We don't even know who we are anymore. We don't know what our principles are. We're afraid to articulate them because if you say certain things, somebody's going to say, ah, look at you. I was speaking at a university last May, and people circulated a petition and said, you can't have this guy or somebody like this speak because he believes that God created the world. No real intellectual would believe that. I mean, this kind of mind-boggling censorship of intellectual freedom is destroying our nation, and we should not tolerate it.
And yet there's a big market for fearlessness, as you've just proven, Doctor. Thanks a lot for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Great talking to you.
Thank you.
For this government on how to get things going. We want to play a couple of sound bites for you and get your reaction because a lot of people appreciate what you say. First of all, here's the President of the United States last night talking about doing all he can for the middle class.
We won't grow the middle class simply by shifting the cost of health care or college onto families that are already struggling, or by forcing communities to lay off more teachers and more cops and more firefighters. Most Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, understand that we can't just cut our way to prosperity. They know that broad-based...
All right, Doctor. He says we can't cut our way to prosperity. I know that's what a lot of Republicans would like to do, more spending cuts. He would like to spend more. You are an independent. What did you think of the President's address last night?
Well, I thought it was a very good delivery. He always has a very good delivery. Very lofty ideals, sort of like the lofty ideals some years ago of cutting the deficit in half. But, it sounds good. But, this whole thing about the middle class, you got to realize you're the president of everybody, upper class, middle class, and lower class. And what we need to be doing is coming up with policies that work for everyone. When all the interlocking parts are functioning well together, then we have a strong union. And I can understand, coming from a background of a community organizer, where it's sort of us against them and we got to get ours. But, you know, that's not what we are, and that's certainly not the position I think the leader of the nation should be in.
It was interesting to hear, Dr. Carson, the word investment, because as you are pointing out, that sounds wonderful. Who would be against investment? But the bottom line comes down to who's going to pay for it. And here are some of the proposals where people will have to pay something. Minimum wage from $7.25, it's going to go up if the president gets his way to $9. Expanding preschool programs, $40 billion towards infrastructure, and combating climate change. We didn't hear necessarily last night about who would pay for it. What do you think?
Well, of course, the taxpayers will pay for it. There's no question about that. But one of the reasons that, you know, I am so enthusiastic about God's plan, which is a flat tax or a tithe, is because everybody has skin in the game. When everyone has skin in the game, I think that's what the framers of the Constitution intended. Everybody to be treated the same. If everybody has skin in the game, you're not going to have one group saying, yeah, let's raise the taxes, because they know that they're not having any. But if everybody is paying a percentage, it makes the government much more reluctant to do things like continue to raise taxes, because they got to face the ire of everybody, not just 1% or 2% or 5%. That was the beauty of the way that we framed our Constitution. We need to go back to egalitarianism.
And Dr. Tu, I also heard the buzz terms last night. Fair share, the rich have to pay a little bit more in order, you know, to help everybody else out. So we're still hearing a lot of those same words in the same tone, even though we already got his tax increase. I was surprised to hear that, to be honest.
The rich do pay more.
Yeah.
The rich do pay more. The top 1% pays 37% of the taxes. The top 5% pays 59% of the taxes. They don't make 59% of the income, so they already do pay more. But, you know, again, if they go back to a tithing system, you make $10 billion, you pay $1 billion, you make 10, you pay 1. That is so simple. That is so fair. Why do we think that we're smarter than God?
Why do you think there's such a disconnect between your version and vision for taxes, which is fair? The billionaire pays 10%. Everybody else pays 10% as well. Whereas the President of the United States, you know, he says billionaires and millionaires need to pay their fair share, which means they essentially carry the water for the rest of the country.
Well, I think it's a philosophical difference. I believe that this is a country that is for, of, and by the people. There are others who believe it's for, of, and by the government. And there's a natural tendency. If you go back and you look at the writings of the people who founded this nation, they talk about how there's a natural tendency for governments to get bigger and bigger and more powerful and to drain the power of the people. They created a constitution that hopefully would stop that from happening. But as more and more people begin to believe in revisionism, and that the Constitution is old, then we're going to have more trouble. And we need to understand who we are. You know,
you're speaking personally because you grew up with adversity, single-parent situation, not in the best of neighborhoods. You turned out to be one of the most prominent neurosurgeons in the world. Why do you think people are so angry at the message that you're speaking about? Shouldn't people look at you and think, wow, that's an admirable accomplishment?
Well, first of all, you know, the vast majority of people are delighted. You know, I ran into somebody yesterday, very left-wing, said that I'm left of Lenin, she said, but I loved your speech and I loved your ideals. You know, some people don't think that we, the people, are supposed to be able to address, you know, the leadership. That's not true. We should be able to put our ideals out there, too. We should be able to discuss these things in a rational way without demonizing people and ascribing all kinds of intentions to them just because they don't agree with us.
Dr. Carson, I watched your whole speech afterwards. I was working during the prayer breakfast. But afterwards, I was just wondering, did you have any interaction with the president after the speech or any of his people? Were anybody upset by how direct you were?
I had interaction with the president himself. He was very cordial, said he enjoyed my remarks and admired me, and a warm handshake. Did I hear from some of his people? I heard from some people that the president and the White House was upset, but I haven't heard that from them. And, you know, I don't pay a lot of attention to stuff that I hear second-handed.
All right, Dr. Ben Carson, neurosurgeon, author.
That might be the best thing you said.
He's retiring soon, so he could end up in politics.
Listen, your book is fantastic. Dr. Carson, thank you very much for joining us today from Baltimore. You're in the white coat. It looks like you've got a busy day ahead of you. Thank you, sir.
Got a lot to do. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Are the people. The president works for us. And, you know, we need to remember that. You know, this is a country that is for, of, and by the people, not for, of, and by the government. And that is the big battle that we are in right now. And we need to make a decision with our eyes open. Which country do we want to be?
It's interesting because you made the comparison of ancient Rome, and you said this could happen to America. Is that something you fear?
I definitely fear it because we're in very much the same position that they were in. So powerful, pinnacle nation in the world, no competition, going to be there forever, so they thought. And then all the military expansionism started. And capturing this group and this group, of course, that requires a lot of resources when you capture people to keep them under control. And they quickly began to run out of money. And then they're looking for any kind of scheme to get money from the people. And the rich people, they have a lot of money, so let's come up with some schemes to get their money. And of course, that erodes another aspect of confidence and creativity within your society. And they just continued right down the path of destruction.
And that could happen here.
It's in the process of happening. The real question is, are we smart enough to stop it? Can we actually learn from those who've gone before us? Or must we inexorably go down the same path as all those people who've preceded us and done the same thing?
Let's hope not. You actually used the phrase on my buddy Neil Cavuto's show. You said somebody's got to stand up to these bullies. Define the bullies that you were talking about.
Well, the bullies I'm talking about are the PC police. And, you know, they come in many shapes and forms. Certainly a lot of them in your business.
I'm very well aware of them, yes.
The media who try to define what you're supposed to think. And unfortunately, I think it's the very thing that our founders were talking about when they said it's so important, and our system of government is based upon a well-informed populace. Because if they're not well-informed, they are very easy to manipulate. And all you have to do is look at some of those Jay Leno segments where they go man on the street.
Jaywalking.
Yeah.
My favorite segment. By your background, this is amazing to me, your background. Your mom was married at 13, one of 24 children?
Yes.
And you were not a very good, you were a troublemaker.
I was perhaps the worst student you've ever seen. You know, I thought I was stupid. All my classmates thought I was stupid, so there was general agreement.
But that was in 5th grade.
That was in 5th grade. Yeah. And, you know, fortunately for me, my mother believed in me when no one else did. And she just said, Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this. I brought them home anyway, but she was always saying that. And one day she just came home after being at work and being inspired by looking at all the books that her employers were reading. And she said, you guys are going to read books and you're going to stop watching so much television. And she made a prediction which is really quite uncanny. She said, if you start reading books, one day people will be looking at you on television. Hi, everybody.
Very well said. But it was even deeper than that. She had a 3rd grade education herself.
Yes.
And you made a comment in that speech that she would look over your reports. You had to write a book report.
Right. She said we had to read 2 books apiece and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. She would put little check marks and highlights, and we would think that she was reading them, but she wasn't. But I hated it so much because everybody else was outside playing and having a good time. My brother and I was stuck in the house reading these books. But after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading the books. Because even though we were desperately poor, between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to read about amazing people. I read about Booker T. Washington, his autobiography called Up From Slavery. He was a slave, and it was illegal for slaves to read. And that right there is a topic in and of itself. that a lot of young people should be thinking about, why was it illegal for slaves to read? Because the slave owners knew that if they could read, they could liberate themselves. And the same thing goes today. Those young people who are not availing themselves of the educational opportunities are intentionally enslaving themselves.
The Latin phrase for education, educere, to bring forth from within, it presupposes all of these kids were born with that talent. That's their gift.
Absolutely.
You had a particular talent, too, in school where you could push people's buttons. I read a commencement address you gave in 2007. That was a particularly good talent of yours.
It was. You know, I would study my classmates to figure out what made them really, really angry because, you know, they were always calling me dummy, so this is the way I would get back at them. And I would figure out what made them angry, and I would just irritate them until they were about to explode. Boy, I would never push the last button until we were in the classroom and the teacher was nearby. And,
all right, stay right there. Dr. Carson, we have a lot more to get to tonight. Still ahead, an open forum between Dr. Carson and our studio audience of journalists, political strategists, medical experts, and much more. Plus, there is already talk about recruiting the doctor for potentially a 2016 run. We're going to check in with Frank Luntz and his focus group, who actually dialed the speech that had everybody talking. And let's just say he may have found some campaign volunteers for Team Carson. Saving America continues straight ahead.
What about our taxation system? So complex. There is no one who can possibly comply with every jot and tittle of our tax and say. What we need to do is come up with something that's simple. And when I pick up my Bible, you know what I see? I see the fairest individual in the universe, God, and he's given us a system. It's called tithe. Now, we don't necessarily have to do it 10%, but it's principle. He didn't say, if your crops fail, don't give me any tithes. He didn't say, if you have a bumper crop, give me triple tithes. So there must be something inherently fair about proportionality.
All right, finally, after months, if not years, of hearing President Obama lecture the so-called rich about paying their fair shares, well, somebody finally had the courage to stand up and issue a rebuttal to the president and his divisive class warfare rhetoric. Now, it came when Dr. Benjamin Carson issued a forceful challenge to the president's liberal approach to last week's National Prayer Breakfast. But unlike so many politicians in Washington, the doctor's comments were much more than meaningless bluster. He actually backed him up with facts and policy proposals, including a flat tax. Joining me now to talk about his approach to saving America's failing economy, my guest for the hour, please, everybody, welcome back, Dr. Benjamin Carson. But I'm just curious. I don't know if anyone's even asked you this question yet. What was the president's reaction personally to your speech? Did you talk to him?
I talked to him afterwards, and he came over. He was very gracious, said, you know, thank you for your speech. He didn't say he enjoyed it, but he did say, and he said he admired me.
I suspect you might have known that going in. Let me play, you said something in talking about the economy that really hit home with me. Okay. And that's about the deficit. $16.5 trillion we have.
That is a number that is so mind-boggling, and that's why I said if you counted one number per second, it would take you 507,000 years, more than 500,000 years. It's a number that's just staggering, and it's continuing to grow. And you know, we sit around and we talk about, well, maybe we can keep it from growing further. We need to reduce it, and the way to reduce it, obviously, is to get the economy growing again. You know, it doesn't really do any good to keep taking from this tree or that tree and squeezing it down. You know, I like parables, so in the book America the Beautiful, I give a parable of two brothers, identical brothers, and they're put on deserted islands with their families. And one had the philosophy, they only ate trees and products of trees. One had the philosophy, I'm going to eat what I need, and I'm going to let the others grow. Pretty soon, he had an entire forest. He had enough food forever. The other one, as soon as a sapling came up, he was on it and eating it. And he and his family eventually starved to death. It's basically the same kind of thing if you keep taking and taking, rather than creating a situation where you can grow. And you look at the fact that we have the highest corporate taxes in the world, and then we wonder why companies are going offshore. Well, we need to go back to basic business school and understand that companies are there to earn money, not to be social welfare organisms.
Mm-hmm. And let me play for you a history. This is President Obama has said many, many times that he's going to fix the debt and the deficit, and he spoke earlier this week at the State of the Union. Let's go down memory lane here.
Now, what I've done throughout this campaign is to propose a net spending cut. And I want to go through the federal budget line by line, page by page. Programs that don't work, we should cut.
Today, I'm pledging to cut the deficit we inherited by half by the end of my first term in office. I will use the money we're no longer spending on war to pay down our debt. My plan would cut our deficit by $4 trillion.
But what my opponent didn't tell you was that federal spending, since I took office, has risen at the slowest pace of any president in almost 60 years.
$6 trillion in new debt since he became president. I'm not asking you a political question.
Right.
To me, this is more of a moral issue.
It is.
You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
And the people years before World War II, it's really when it started deteriorating, always felt that we needed to pay our debts down. And again, you'll see lots of quotes in the book about what our founding fathers and some of our predecessors thought about sending debt to the next generation, that in fact it was immoral. We've just completely forgotten about that now.
Yeah, I think that is a defining issue of our time.
It is. And, you know, the other thing is we need to create a situation that has everybody involved. Everybody has to have skin in the game in order to make this work. We talk about an egalitarian society. Well, if everybody is paying according to their ability, which is what the tithing system was, it's proportional. If you make a gazillion dollars, you pay a lot of tax. If you make very little, you pay very little tax. But your skin is in the game. Now, the reason that our government, as it stands now, doesn't like that is because if everybody has skin in the game, it makes it a whole lot harder for you to raise taxes. And now you got to be accountable to everybody, and you can't just make 1% or 2% or 5%. Man.
We're going to take a break. We'll come back, and when we come back, Dr. Carson will share with us his prescription for curing America's failing healthcare system. And then Ben Carson for president? Well, that was the headline of a recent Wall Street Journal editorial. So are politics in the doctor's future? We'll ask him. And Frank Luntz and his focus group dial the doctor's prayer breakfast speech as Saving America continues. We're glad you're with us.
Here's my solution. When the person is born, give them a birth certificate, an electronic medical record, and a health savings account, to which money can be contributed pre-tax from the time you're born to the time you die. When you die, you can pass it on to your family members so that when you're 85 years old and you got 6 diseases, you're not trying to spend up everything. You're happy to pass it on, and there's nobody talking about death panels.
And welcome back to the special studio audience edition of Hannity. We're calling it Saving America. Joining me tonight for the hour is Dr. Benjamin Carson. Now, ever since his remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast, he has quickly become one of the leading voices against government-run health care. But again, unlike so many of our elected representatives in Washington, he isn't simply just complaining. He's offering real, reasonable answers to help fix the problem. And we welcome back Dr. Carson. And again, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
You gave a speech, a commencement speech in 2007, and you used a great analogy about if you give people their own accounts, and you used food stamps as an analogy.
Right.
And you said people don't buy a porterhouse on day one.
Right, exactly, because, you know, there are some government programs that do work, and food stamps do save people's lives. I think probably it's been abused a little bit and gone beyond that point now, but it serves as a good model because when people get their monthly allocation, they don't go out and buy porterhouse steak the first 5 days and starve the rest of the month. They learn how to allocate. And if you make people responsible financially for their own health with their own health savings account, believe me, they're not going to run off to the emergency room where things cost 5 times as much. They're going to go to a clinic. They get the same treatment in the clinic, but the difference is in the clinic, if they have some chronic disease, hypertension, diabetes, what have you. Now you're going to get that under control too, so you're not back there in 3 weeks with another problem. So it begins to make a great deal of difference. Also, with the health savings account, you are going to develop a relationship with that healthcare provider. It's not this big nebulous third party. It's you and the provider. And you're not going to allow that provider to say you need 5 CT scans when you only need 1, nor is he going to suggest that because he knows that's coming directly out of your HSA. And it's going to bring medicine more into the free market because people are now going to be competing. And this is the way it should be.
You know, it's interesting. I have never been able to figure out. Government never put our Social Security money in a lockbox like they said they would. Medicare's headed for bankruptcy. We talked about the debt, $16 trillion. Why do you think so many people put their faith, hope, trust in government to be the answer? And what do you think of Obamacare?
Well, I think that we've been programmed, unfortunately, to become victims and to think that somebody should be taking care of us. We've gone to a can-do nation to a what can you do for me nation. And we start inculcating that into people at an early age. You go to schools now, and they don't want to give the outstanding academic award because everybody's outstanding. And they don't want anybody to feel bad. You know, come on, give me a break. But you know, you start all of that stuff.
You can't play dodgeball either, doctor. You know, you can't keep score.
Yeah. So it perpetuates itself throughout their lives. And all of a sudden you wind up with a bunch of people who want to occupy everything because, you know, it's theirs anyway. You didn't deserve that. It should be mine.
Doesn't that go back to a lesson that you say your mother taught you about you control your destiny?
Absolutely.
And these health savings accounts? And you even said people that are poor and indigent,
right,
that there would be a way to help them.
Right, because the government is already spending enormous amounts of money on healthcare dollars on indigent people. Taking not all of that money, only a portion of it, but divvying it up into people's HSAs, over which they now have some control, would make a huge difference. Now, will it be necessary to do some fine-tuning, and will it be necessary to create some encouragements for people who are not indigent to put money into their HSAs, to encourage their employers to put money into their HSAs? Yes, but these are all things that we can work out. What we need to do is get out of the framework of as soon as somebody's saying something, say, no, that can't work, that's why I can't, and say, you know, yeah, that can work, and here's how it can work. And if we begin to put our minds together and understand the concept that we're aiming at, and that is bringing some personal responsibility into the healthcare arena, we can solve that problem. We've got to get over the ideology. If we strain everything through an ideological screen, we will never make any progress.
Let me ask you, how many people in our audience, if I can get an audience shot, think that if the Republicans articulated what Dr. Carson is saying, you're laughing. How many of you think Obamacare maybe wouldn't have passed? Show of hands. Yeah. So there's a failure on the political opposition side of that debate too then.
And I don't know why that is.
I don't know either.
I'm not sure why they're not coming up with the right kinds of answers here.
Well, that dovetails perfectly into our next segment about your potential political future. When we come back, Carson 2016 has a nice ring to it, but are politics in the doctor's future? I'll ask him. Plus, Frank Luntz and his focus group, they dialed Dr. Carson's prayer breakfast remarks, and wait till you see what caused the dials to go through the roof across party lines. All of that and more as our special studio audience edition of Hannity rolls on. Welcome back to the studio audience edition of Hannity, and tonight we are focusing on saving America with a very special guest, Dr. Benjamin Carson. Now, he is the director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University. Now, his remarks at last week's National Prayer Breakfast not only set the blogosphere on fire, it also resulted in many asking him to consider a run for elected office. Now, that includes the Wall Street Journal editorial board, which recently published a column that was titled, quote, Ben Carson for President. Now, in just a moment, I'll ask him if he has any plans to pursue a career in politics. But first, pollster Frank Luntz recently convened a focus group of California voters and asked them to watch and dial the doctor's popular speech. Let's take a look at this.
Sean, the words of Benjamin Carson have really struck a chord with a lot of Americans. We're here in Los Angeles with a group of swing voters, and we want to know what they think of his language. But before we go to them, let's go to a clip that dialed particularly well. Remember, the red line represents swing Republicans, the green line swing Democrats. On the deficit and debt, man, does this guy score well.
Our deficit is a big problem. Think about it. And our national debt, $16.5 trillion. You think that's not a lot of money? Tell you what, count one number per second, which you can't even do because once you get to 1,000, it'll take you longer than a second. But one number per second. You know how long it would take you to count the 16 trillion? 507,000 years. More than 500,000 years to get there. We have to deal with this.
Clearly that language connected. Now tell me, Dr. Carson, what was so powerful? Give me a word or phrase to describe him.
Passionate.
Articulate.
Sincere.
Bold and real.
Analytical.
Self-reliant.
Truthful. Sincere.
Believable.
Provocative.
Is this the kind of guy that you want to see in politics? Is this the kind of guy, yet why yes?
He's a guy he speaks his mind, and he's very open-minded and
why yes?
passionate.
He speaks for positions, I think, basically.
I liked his sense of fairness. I felt he was very fair in what he was saying.
What is it about him that cut across partisan lines? You never see that in politics these days.
He seemed to care. He seemed to genuinely care about what he was talking about.
To me, he was just like me. He was just a regular, ordinary person.
Do you think that he was too aggressive? The president was there. Some people thought that it was inappropriate for him to say what he said. You're nodding your head no. You think it was appropriate?
I think it was appropriate because you have to hit on the topics that people want to talk about, and we can't keep candy coating everything. So,
and this is our country.
What does that mean?
It belongs to all of us, not just to the people in Washington. All of us.
Do you think that people in Washington listen to you?
No.
Do you think he listens to you?
Yes. He being?
Dr. Carson.
Yes.
So there's a language there. Keep going.
And like you said, it's un-American to bite your tongue, to hold back and not say what you think.
You guys agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. It's a good way to get out of the segment. Sean, there aren't many people right now who have the language to connect to the American people, whether it's American values, as you speak of, or common sense, as she spoke of. But there's something about the doctor's message and delivery that really does connect across partisan lines. Very impressive. Back to you.
All right, it sounds like Frank may have found some, well, Carson campaign volunteers and still with us to talk about the possibility of a career in politics. The man himself, Dr. Benjamin Carson. Just a quick poll. How many of you would like to see Dr. Carson run? Wow. Okay, that's everybody. What do you make of that?
Well, I've always said that the only way I would go into politics is if God grabbed me by the collar and stuck me there. It's not something that has been an ambition of mine, but I do have a great desire to get our populace educated. Because if we get our populace educated, they will be able to decipher the truth from what's false. And if we don't start doing that, we're going to go down the same path as all the pinnacle nations that preceded us.
You have said, and I've read a lot of speeches now that you have given, and in commencement speeches and elsewhere, and even I think you mentioned in this speech, that doctors played a very pivotal role in terms of our founding and our framers, yes. And you want to see doctors more involved in politics.
I do, because doctors and scientists learn to make decisions based on facts. They use empirical data as opposed to ideologues who don't really have any facts to make their decisions on.
Can I ask, you retire in June.
Yes.
I'm even hesitant to ask you this, but I think I have to because it's on the table. Do you consider, are you aligned with a party? Would you want to answer who you voted for president?
I'm independent.
Okay.
And, I tend to align myself closer with parties that are doing things or advocating things that would be good for the country. And that should tell you who I voted for. I won't go any further than that.
Okay. I'll take it. Anyone want to take any bets? But all right. All right. When we come back, we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to open all this up to our studio audience of political strategists, journalists, medical experts, much more, as they, along with Dr. Carson, they offer up their solutions for helping to save America, whether it's the economy, health care, all issues on the table. Our studio audience, they'll join the discussion next. Welcome back to the special studio audience edition of Hannity, and Dr. Benjamin Carson is with us. All right, you ready to take our audience questions?
Absolutely.
All right, let's start over here. Jason.
I wanted you to ask you about kids growing up in circumstances that you grew up in today, in the ghetto in particular.
Yes.
What's missing? Are there not enough adults with that sort of mindset? Is it a leadership failure? Is it a breakdown of the family? What's the problem?
Combination of the things that you mentioned. There's a great family breakdown. For instance, when you look at the African American community, 70% of the babies are born out of wedlock. Now, you're not supposed to talk about that because all family situations are supposed to be equal these days, right? But they're not equal. That father is very much needed, and producing the right kinds of role models for the children and giving them a value system. Because if you don't provide them with a value system at home, they're going to find it somewhere else, and it may not be a good value system. You combine that with the fact that when they go to school, in many cases, they're surrounded by a bunch of politically correct people who begin to indoctrinate them in something other than the can-do attitude, and we got a problem.
Dr. Siegel?
You know, Dr. Carson, I'm not surprised that a doctor like you, who's a top pediatric neurosurgeon, who literally has the brains of children in his hands, personal responsibility would be your first and foremost idea. And taking that theme further, I wonder, you started talking about health savings accounts and skin in the game. How do you feel about this idea that if patients knew what they were buying, knew what they were getting, how much a CAT scan cost, how much an MRI cost? Instead, we have a system where all of this feeds together with physicians who are afraid of malpractice, afraid of being sued. So many tests are ordered unnecessarily. Yes. On the patient side, they don't know what they're getting. On the doctor side, they're afraid of not ordering it. What do you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, I would say that you look at all the countries in the world, we're the ones who have the big problem with malpractice. So what is it that's here that isn't everywhere else? The Trial Lawyers Association. Okay, special interest groups. Anything in our society almost that comes out of Washington that doesn't make sense is attached to a special interest group. They've become, as I alluded to in the speech, the fourth branch of government. Until we deal with that, we're going to keep doing things that don't make sense.
Deneen?
Well, Dr. Carson, I want to thank you for your leadership. But you do know that the black liberal establishment is not going to be happy with you. And I'm talking about the community activists, some of the pastors, some of the politicians, and the black media, because it's your story of success that they don't want communicated to the black community because they thrive on talking about blacks are victims and need special treatment. So I want to thank you for all you do and for your leadership, because we need more leaders such as yourself to communicate the story that America really is an exceptional country.
Absolutely, thank you. And I've heard from a lot of black leaders, actually, since this time, who are very thrilled with what I'm saying. I'm sure there are some that are not, but people are starting to think for themselves, and this is what I really enjoy. Black people, white people, brown people, yellow people, think for yourself. Don't be a puppet.
Celia?
So the Government Accountability Office came out with their year-end fiscal report back in January, and they said that we need to start running surpluses of 1% over the next century just to keep the same debt to GDP ratio we have today. Right. The Senate can't even budget or process a budget in the Senate right now. How do we shift the narrative to start talking about surpluses?
Well, you know, I think we would get surpluses almost immediately if we changed our policies, if we took away a lot of the burdensome regulations, if we dropped the tax rates, you would see money flooding back into this place if we just gave people the kinds of incentives that they used to have. And you look what happened in this country when we didn't have an oppressive government and when we did encourage entrepreneurship. We just skyrocketed. It's all pent up right now, ready to go. Look at all the money that's on Wall Street. That money would be invested immediately if people felt that there wasn't some nefarious government out there trying to figure out how to get their money.
And by the way, the money wouldn't be in the Caymans, which you mentioned in your speech. And also if we would drill.
Yes.
Drilling, natural gas, whether Saudi Arabia.
I mean, you look at North and South Dakota, Montana, you look at all that shale up there.
Oh, it's crazy.
I mean, we could just blow Saudi Arabia off the map economically.
Yeah, I love not being PC. Jeff Lord.
Doctor, I'm taking care of my 93-year-old mom, and so we have a few doctors in our life. And one of them left his practice not long ago for something called, I'm learning, called the concierge practice. Another is very concerned about his practice and its continuance and his role in his own practice. Can you talk a little bit about how this Obamacare is affecting doctors in the medical community?
Yes. Well, first of all, recognize that you have to go back and look at this historically. When Medicare, Medicaid first came along, you know, doctors who took care of those patients knew that they weren't going to make any money, but they were okay with it because the insurance companies at that time did have to pay for the ones who did have insurance. And just about every doctor, Dr. Siegel can tell you, had a percentage of their practice that was indigent, and they didn't care. We've always taken care of those patients. But now, because the margins are so narrow, because the insurance companies can do what they want to do, they're not capable of doing that anymore. And, you know, I do think we need some insurance reform also, because when you stop and you think about it, one of the major pillars of our medical system are insurance companies that make money by denying people care. We need to deal with that situation because that's an inherent conflict of interest. And I'm sure if we sit down and put our heads to it, we can figure out a way that they can make an adequate profit and people can still be taken care of. But remember, when we go to the HSA situation, the insurance companies will have a very different role because they will just be doing bridge insurance, and we also will have a way of taking care of catastrophic insurance.
All right, we're going to take a break. We'll come back more with our studio audience and Dr. Carson on the special edition of Hannity. And welcome back to the special audience edition of Hannity, and Dr. Ben Carson is with us, and we're taking questions. Our good friend Sandra Smith of the Fox Business Network.
Lightning round?
Dr. Carson.
Yeah, this will be the lightning round because we don't have a lot of time.
Sure, and I think that one of the biggest questions after listening to you tonight, it's been an absolute pleasure, is have we gone too far? Do you think that America can come back from where we are today?
Great question.
I do think that. That's why I wrote the book, because I think we have what it takes to do it. We're just going to have to speak up. That's the key.
Jamie?
It's January 2017. You've just been inaugurated President of the United States. What would be your top legislative priorities?
Well, assuming that things are continuing the way they are now, we got to get the economy working again because that will take care of the jobs. Productivity rather than just mindless jobs.
All right, Leslie.
Doctor, when you say things people don't want to hear, usually there's an immediate effort to delegitimize the speaker. Were you concerned about that before you made that speech in that forum with that audience?
I wasn't concerned because there's nothing that they can do to delegitimize me. There's no skeleton that they can find. They're going to try. Good luck.
Yeah. You actually said in one of your speeches, live a clean life. You don't have to worry, and don't lie because you don't have to worry about what you said 3 months ago. I read that.
He's good.
Kerry.
Doctor, in the 1960s, you had Ronald Reagan speaking out against socialized medicine for the AMA. The AMA made a complete 180 and was speaking out for Obamacare. What happened?
Well, first of all, only 23% of doctors belong to the AMA. And they go and they grab those ones and they say, this represents the AMA. Enough said.
Betsy?
I'd like to know how you would solve this problem as a doctor and also as President of the United States. Section 1311 of this law empowers the federal government.
Law.
The Obama Health Law empowers the federal government for the first time in history to dictate how doctors treat privately insured patients, even if you bought a plan like an Aetna plan or a Cigna plan and paid for it yourself. How will you protect that doctor-patient relationship?
Probably by rewriting that law.
Good answer.
Doctor, thank you so much for speaking your mind. I certainly hope you keep it up in the future. But who in the current debate reflects your values and views the most effectively of anybody in politics or public life?
Well, I certainly enjoyed what Senator Rubio had to say last night. And I'm sure there are many up-and-coming young people, Bobby Jindal, and we'll just have to keep looking and hoping that people are courageous and forward-thinking.
Heather?
Does a message of personal responsibility sell politically anymore? We've seen President Obama suggesting universal pre-kindergarten care, basically telling parents that it's not their responsibility to prepare their children for school, but rather the government's. I don't think your mother would have bought that message. She understood that it was for you to do that, but we seem to be expanding things that the government can do instead of individuals.
Yes.
Can a politician stand up and say, sorry, we're not going to give you any more programs? It's for you to take care of your lives?
I think it can sell, but we have to start talking about it. You see, the politically correct police have silenced the debate. We have to create the debate again, and a lot of the people who are in the middle will have an aha moment.
Stefano.
The speech with the part about your mother touched me so deeply as a mother of young boys, and I'm wondering how can we best limit the government in a way that creates a million Mrs. Carsons raising up her sons and herself out of poverty into prosperity. How do we do that?
We become smart voters. And you know, a lot of people, they go into the voting booth, they say, oh, there's a name I recognize. Yeah, I'm voting for that one. That's about all they know. If you don't know more than that, you probably should just not vote, or you need to go and teach yourself, because you could be voting against your self-interest.
Dr. Siegel,
do you think the president heard you? I was hoping that with everything that had happened, that he'd come up to you afterwards and say, I heard you. Do you think he heard you?
I'm praying that he did. If he did, you should see some changes in his actions.
You would, you're based in Baltimore, and you touched on Medicaid earlier, and as you know, the health outcomes of patients on Medicaid are a lot poorer than they are for private insurance because it underpays docs and underpays hospitals. But this is the big debate in states around the country, is whether they should expand their Medicaid programs as Obamacare requires them to do. If you were advising the governor of Maryland, what would you tell him to do with the Medicaid expansion?
Well, I would say we need to start talking about something that makes sense. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest a lot of our eggs in something that doesn't work.
Jedediah, real quick.
Yeah, I'm a former teacher and dean, and I just want to know, how do we get young people to care about the debt and deficit?
I think we have to give them examples, like the one that I gave, 507,000 years, so they begin to understand what they're facing.
I'm sorry, we missed 3 people. Go ahead, Mary, quick.
I was just going to say it's easier to be ignorant and reliant than it is to be responsible and informed. How do you change that?
Well, one of the things we're going to have to do, and I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but we have to use technology. There are some wonderful ways that we can use that. Virtual classrooms that can help us enormously. I'm working on that project with something in Baltimore right now.
And you have your scholarship fund, and it's on
Absolutely.
the web at
carsonscholars.org.
All right.
Everybody get involved.
All right. Dr. Clark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great honor to have you.
Absolutely.
And that is all the time we have left. As always, thank you for being with us. Let not your heart be troubled. The news continues. We'll see you back here Monday night.